Good evening to everyone once again. Today's topic is an extremely important subject, the end of Afghan war and the America's changing geopolitical priorities. And you can't have anyone better than the chief guest that we have today with us, Mr. Michael Johns. His career is very interesting and significantly of great importance for us to understand the subject. He's been the speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush. He's been in the White House, and he's also a leading, globally recognized thought leader, communicator, and a strategist. He's also a health professional. He has served in the White House as in the advisory as well as speechwriting capacities for much of the Republican administrations. He's a staunch and a hardcore Republican and a conservative, thought leader. He has been a policy analyst in the Retd Foundation, and he's also the co-founder of the U.S. Tea Party movement, which supports the conservative thought process, largely accentuated by the Republican Party. Michael has been there at a time when the first Iraq war was planned and executed, and thereafter he's been continuously involved in following up the involvement in the further developments that led to the American involvement in the Afghanistan in post-2001. I welcome Michael to the Peninsula Foundation. It's a think tank based in Chennai, and we have a great pleasure in having you on board with us. And let me first start off without wasting any more time on further issues. Let me first raise the question, the end of Afghan war as announced by the Biden administration. How well planned it is, how ad hoc it has been, what kind of a mess has it created, and is it the end of the 20-year war as the Biden administration has claimed? And we would start from there. Then, of course, we will move on to a lot of.
Well, that's really right at the heart of the question as to what we're confronting. Let me say a few things as it relates to that. Number one, I don't think we can at all definitively say that the idea of war in Afghanistan has come to an end. In fact, I think you have to look at the quite significant possibility that the departure of U.S. troops, what appears to be the premature departure of U.S. troops, the collapse of the democratically elected government, and this ruthless Taliban force, which has been engaged in war crimes and vast abuses of human rights and women's rights, is well documented, but much more severe than I think is even appreciated in the West and in the United States, shows no indication of any commitment to a peace process. Additionally, I have, well, let's just look at the history of what transpired. I mean, if we start with the Trump administration of 2016, as you may know, I endorsed President Trump on the first day of his candidacy in June of 2015. So a year and a half campaign defending the Make America Great Again agenda. One of the core foreign policy positions that former President Trump took, and is one I supported, was that the war in Afghanistan, unlike the war in Iraq, was a highly justifiable engagement of U.S. forces. There was no real serious option for us not to have gone after bin Laden following 9/11. As you know, the Taliban, then in control of the Afghan government, refuses to turn bin Laden over to the United States, essentially leaving us with no option. And there was a broad bipartisan consensus in the United States and in most free nations of the world, and ultimately the UN as well for that engagement. And that engagement. Well, let me sort of take it from the George W. Bush period. I mean, so George W. Bush, in my view, has a mixed track record on this. Number one, I also worked for the chairman of the 9/11 Commission, Tom Kaine, so I'm very familiar with the contents of that and the issues that really, I think, gave rise to 9/11, which was a preventable attack. I mean, there was an extraordinary, almost voluminous amount of intelligence information that had been gathered by the United States, including by our FBI, including by CIA and DIA and others regarding the threat that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were representing in Afghanistan. Of course, he'd been evicted from Saudi Arabia, been evicted from Sudan. Clinton had failed to take him out when we had him on satellite imaging in Sudan, which might have been absolutely is, in retrospect, one of the great strategic errors of the United States. It could have prevented 9/11. But the intel that was coming to us, including that from Ahmad Shah Massoud and others, really wasn't acted on or didn't reach, or wasn't digested in the proper way. And that was one of the conclusions of the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission also made a lot of other conclusions that haven't been acted on by the United States, including the fact that overstayed visas in the US were one of the contributing factors. A good number of the 19 hijackers did not have a legal right to be in the United States. We have a very unregulated system there. So, and then, so this was an attack that did happen on his watch, and that's the bad news. The good news is his response to it was magnificent. I mean, he rallied the country, and we very quickly take out the Taliban and begin our pursuit of bin Laden. But we're now then into a 20-year war by the Trump administration. Bin Laden, of course, somewhat known to us, but not really pursued, is given safe harbor in Pakistan, almost certainly, in my view, with support at least from the ISI, the intelligence division of Pakistan, but potentially from the entire government. And that complicates the process of trying to find him. The Taliban launched counterattacks. So this drags on to the longest conflict in American history, which is, quite an extraordinarily expensive one. Some of the estimates go as high as $5 to $7 trillion. So I supported the fact that we had lost almost 3,000 American KIAs in Afghanistan. Good number of contractors too, might have been several thousand contractors. And this $5 to $7 trillion was money that we were allocating that could have been allocated to any, American interest. We were talking about rebuilding some of our infrastructure. The estimates on that were $1 to $2 trillion. So we could have rebuilt the infrastructure in the United States 3 to 4 times over for what we did in this conflict. And I thought we were, as Trump believed, we were getting to a point of sort of law of diminishing returns, meaning even though we were making military progress against the Taliban, it was reaching that point where every KIA that we had against the Taliban was almost further inspiring the Taliban. It was a little bit reminiscent of the Vietnam War in that way, where you finally reached the conclusion that there was no idea that there was not going to be a military victory over the Taliban like there could have been over Al-Qaeda, like there was over ISIS. And so Trump runs basically on this position that he's going to bring an end to the so-called endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's a position that ends up being pretty broadly supported by many of the same base of voters that had supported George W. Bush, but then others. I think many were awaiting a candidate who could both project strength and an understanding of that there was this threat of terrorism was real, but also simultaneously understood that we could not forever maintain this ongoing conflict.
But Michael, wasn't the geopolitical objectives, I just read the the Afghanistan papers where, the ambassador Ryan Crocker and General Douglas Lute, and the book is authored by Craig Whitlock, brings out a fair amount of issues where lessons need to be learned. One of the major issues that this doesn't seem to have been a clarity in the political objective for what America went into Afghanistan after 9/11, which in the initial stage was fundamentally to sort out the source of terrorist attack for 9/11, which is Al-Qaeda. And then if Taliban was the enemy and the Taliban was harboring Al-Qaeda and it had to be neutralized, then after 20 years, you're handing over power back to Taliban. Isn't that a big paradox?
Oh, of course. Yeah, let me get to somewhere. I'm going to level some pretty major criticisms here on U.S. policy, which, I'm very displeased with where we are on this. But I wanted to at least offer a defense of President Trump's management, because one of the debates in the United States that's being, the Biden administration is really stretching to defend the colossal, I don't want to call it a mismanagement, because it's possible that this was managed exactly as planned, but the end result is clearly hugely negative for U.S. strategic interests, hugely negative for Afghanistan and human rights concerns. And it's an all-around disastrous management by Biden. But one of their positions is, well, no, it was Trump who originally got us into this commitment to get out of Afghanistan. And I want to just be clear. As you, I'm sure, well know, that the agreement, that the Doha agreement that the United States entered into with the Taliban was a very condition-based agreement under which we would take a move, they would take a move. It was filled with reciprocity. Under no circumstances would President Trump have looked at that situation and allowed the outcome to have been the Taliban's military advance on Kabul and the seizing of power over a democratic government, and now apparently a clear, I think, to the world again, the harboring of terrorist elements within Afghanistan. So the two of the primary conditions that were placed on the Taliban were, number one, that they were not to attack U.S. military personnel or installations, and number two, that they were not to harbor any terrorist elements, Al-Qaeda, the long litany of lists of terrorist elements that they have had historical relationships with. So, but Biden comes in, we have a very controversial election, in the United States, as I'm sure you know, with, a lot of concerns as it relates to voting integrity. But, Biden starts to execute this. My alarm started going off in July with the management of the overnight departure from the air base that I'm sure you're very familiar with and have flown out of there many times. I'm quite sure of that. But as you know, that base was incredibly important to the U.S. during the Cold War. It was built in the 1950s. We put millions and millions of dollars into it, tens of millions ultimately. We lost it then, of course, in 1979 when the Soviets invade, but reclaim it, and then it, upgraded in some capacity. You could have made an argument for saying we're going to leave Afghanistan, but we're going to maintain its presence. We're going to maintain the air base. That would have been a possibility. And that air base is, I believe, 400 miles from China and 500 miles from Iran. So, you talk about strategic location, given two of the primary adversarial relationships we have in the world right now. But so here's where the problems begin to validate what you're asking. Number one, we have had 20 years of experience now in handing off military assets to the governments of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a process. It's an incremental process. It's highly planned. It's very deliberate, and done so for good reason, that we want to both objectively ensure that whatever the military asset is that's involved is properly transferred and protected in a state of conflict. But number two, it's also kind of got a kind of a public perception dimension, is that you want to make sure that it's clear that we're not just picking up and running away. So, in this case, Biden, it now apparently appears violating guidance or refusing to accept guidance given to him by some of the military personnel that have testified in recent days, literally leaves in the middle of the night, including leaving behind, this is the beginning of leaving behind vast military assets there. And then, of course, at the airbase hasn't received enough attention, this prison facility that was housing some of the world's most dangerous terrorists. And Biden leaves that completely unguarded. And of course, the Taliban quickly freed a sizable number, I believe it was over 1,000 terrorists that were being housed there, that were just at that point liberated. This is the first time I looked at it and I said, there is absolutely no conceivable way that you would take these steps if you were designed to maintain the security of Afghanistan. There appeared to me, and this is my thesis, and I want to say, because I'm going to try to keep this very fact-based, but I'll give you some of my perspectives. It's very, very difficult for me to look at this the whole series of measures that he took and say that he was committed to defending and protecting the stability of the Afghan government and was adequately concerned with not empowering the Taliban, because we're not even just talking about one decision of the withdrawal, but a series of probably a dozen decisions that start in July, right before July, like the first few days of July, with this literally the Afghans at the base, as you will probably well know, literally woke up the next day like, where are the Americans? I mean, there was no communication, no advance notice, no handoff ceremony, and no plan put in place for the ongoing protection of the base in the absence of U.S. military presence there.
Absolutely, yeah. I understand from what you actually say that President Trump would have had a much more conditional and a more calibrated, plan for withdrawal and retaining power of an elected Afghan government. But let's come to also the most important aspect. Any terrorist organization and insurgent organization cannot survive without a sanctuary. And that sanctuary very clearly is Pakistan.
Yep.
And therefore, there's been always, very, very tentative approach to dealing with that sanctuary in Pakistan, whether it's ISI or even the government itself. And unless, that gets addressed, it was impossible to find a solution to the Taliban problem in Afghanistan or reform. I mean, you actually brought in a change in a generation over 20 years in Afghanistan, but all of that is destroyed when you allowed Taliban to take over completely. All of that is destroyed, isn't it?
It's I would argue even worse. I mean, the potential magnitude of the crisis we now confront in Afghanistan has the possibility of being a situation vastly more threatening than even that existed on September 10th, 2001, in the sense that we now have two nuclear powers in Pakistan and China's Communist Party that see great opportunity and have great designs for their involvement in Afghanistan and the Taliban that. Well, firstly, let me just take Pakistan. In the absence of Pakistan, there probably wouldn't have ever even been a Taliban. I mean, there were sufficient large numbers of Taliban that received religious training and schooling in Pakistan, and the role that the ISI played both in the financial support of the Taliban. By the way, this goes all the way back to the Soviet occupation, and that was really my introduction to Afghanistan, was trying to ensure, as one of the key champions of the Reagan doctrine in the United States, that the aid was getting to what we call the Afghan Mujahideen, not the Arab Mujahideen, which was bin Laden and a whole bunch of individuals that wouldn't be recognizable. The most Americans, but that we're, just to be clear, we were very aware that there were dangerous forces within this, what we monolithically called the Mujahideen, but as you well know, we're really a whole broad number of resistance movements. And I was drawn to Ahmad Shah Massoud for a whole bunch of reasons: his leadership skills, the fact that he had a political vision on top of his obvious military leadership capabilities. He was an incredibly brave fighter, and he motivated people. And that entire, what ultimately became Northern Alliance in the Panjshir Valley, was one that he understood, and incredibly not known to many, but he protected that entire valley throughout the Soviet occupation, and protected it from the Taliban. I mean, two incredibly extraordinary military victories against some very ruthless forces. So, and the Soviets were incredibly ruthless in their approach in Afghanistan. We were a little more timid, I think, in our concern for doing damage beyond that of the direct enemy. But then, so you had the withdrawal from the air base, and then when you look at it's almost like all of these steps and policy initiatives that were taken by the Biden administration were done in reverse order. And you can start with the air base, because I don't believe that would be the first, second, or third thing you would do. It probably might be the last thing you do. And as I argued, it might be something you don't even do at all. I mean, because we were talking about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. The idea of maintaining that base, and as we've done in Asia, and as we've done in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere, would have been an option that and one that I think Trump would have possibly looked at, or he certainly would not have done this in this series of events. So they start the military withdrawal before the civilian withdrawal, and that leaves Americans and Afghans who had worked with us in direct and immediate danger. I literally have had hundreds of inquiries, as I'm sure you have, from individuals who I know supported our operations there, either overtly in the government or covertly, who we have an obligation to. There was no sense of obligation communicated. By the way, that's one of the worst messages that we can send the world. It's not even just an Afghanistan issue, because we have to rely on a reputation for being a country that keeps our word and protects those who cooperate and work with us, or, as Xi Jinping's government was quick to point out, to Taiwan, we become, unreliable, and we cannot have that image. So it's a hugely dangerous geopolitical message that was sent. And then to leave the billions of dollars of military equipment behind. I mean, I don't have to explain this to anyone with any military experience like yourself, but American military is the most powerful military in the world, in the history of the world. They're very strategically minded, down to the most micro level. It's inconceivable that no one gets around to addressing the question of, these billions of dollars of equipment. You just want us to leave this behind for the Taliban? No, obviously that's a conscious decision.
But hasn't that been a sort of a repetition that's been happening earlier as well? If you really look at Afghanistan, it is American involvement, and the war is actually over 4 decades. Starting off prior to the Soviet invasion, when Zbigniew Brzezinski initiated the Mujahideen support system. And I've seen some of your writings where you've actually called out, the biggest mistake that America made was after the Soviets had gone and the Mujahideens had, taken control, and then there was a bit of a chaos, and Taliban has come into power. That phase of 90s, that phase of 90s until 9/11.
Under Clinton,
I think America went to sleep, just forgot, and then allowed ISI and Pakistan.
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right about that. It is my belief that while there is an understanding, the United States is a kind of reluctant participant in a lot of ways in global affairs. In fact, we had no formal diplomatic relations with Afghanistan until 1921. I think it was Warren Harding who initiated our first diplomatic engagement. And then, while Afghanistan historically had been kind of close to Germany, they were neutral in World War II. So we really had no sizable magnitude of relationship even with Afghanistan until the 40s, when Afghanistan opens an embassy in the United States, and pretty unknown, but our ambassador in Kabul is killed at that time is taken hostage and is killed in a rescue attempt of him. And then, of course, the series of developments, which I'll just quickly summarize as being a very centerpiece Cold War conflict over what was the most overt example of Soviet expansionist military. So we all knew, I think, as anti-communists who had legitimate studied concerns about where the Soviet Union was going. There was no better example than December 24th, 1979. That's Christmas Eve in the United States. As tanks roll into Kabul and they seize this fairly obscure country in the eyes of most Americans, but that initiates an incredible and still ongoing level of concern about Afghanistan from a geopolitical, geostrategic standpoint. So where I'm going with this is all by saying that there are things we've done incredibly well in Afghanistan, and there's some things that we have really consciously or unconsciously mismanaged, and that's I want to raise the possibility of conscious mismanagement. So obviously Clinton had the opportunity to take out, as I mentioned, bin Laden when he was in Sudan, did not do that, even though he ultimately ends up on the FBI most wanted list. And then in Afghanistan, 1989, Soviets withdraw, and we do too. So we kind of, aware as we were that there were these dangerous hardline Islamic movements, including what ultimately in the 1990s formulates as the Taliban, with strong Pakistani support. A continued engagement on a minimal level there could conceivably have disallowed the civil wars that emerged after the Soviet, and to the two major civil wars that arise between the Soviet departure and our initiation of military engagement in October of 2001. 3 to 4 weeks after 9/11, pretty expeditious engagement.
But that's the question, because at that point of time it looked a very effective strategy to use religion and the Islamic radicalization of the Mujahideens, the Taliban, and you mentioned about the Arab Mujahideens who played a role as well in raising a lot of disturbance in Kashmir subsequently. Now, but that is a very, very potent, tool to have triggered, to have used at that point of time. And do you believe that that tool has gone completely out of control? Because there is also a state which is a theological Islamist state like Pakistan, which uses that as a state strategy. And therefore, it becomes a very potent cocktail, and it's completely out of control right now.
Here's what I really strongly feel transpired is that, and I, for good fortune, I happen to have been on the right side of these arguments. I mean, I'm not bragging about that, but it's instinct and study and experience, I guess, all come together. But you know, in the 1980s, I was one of, it couldn't have been more than a handful of Americans engaged in foreign policy in Washington, D.C., who began speaking openly about the fact that I believed that victory in the Cold War was not only a possibility, but that it could be done peacefully and that it could be done quickly. And I want to tell you that in some of the most seemingly prestigious institutions in that city, their Sovietologists and purported experts on this really ultimately knew nothing, just like they have on China. They've been wrong on that as well. It's an incredible disservice. And this was a laughable position that was held of mine, but it was one of the theses as we developed and implemented the Reagan Doctrine. As you correctly point out, Brzezinski kind of does kind of a first few steps on the Carter NSC, but even there he's facing resistance. Carter's weakness was one factor in Brezhnev's decision to move on Afghanistan. I think that and you know, the fall of Iran and the fall of Nicaragua that in 1979 was a very bad year for American foreign policy. But you know, we're into this. I describe, I'll just try to condense this, but I think it's hugely relevant. I describe what I see as three colonial sort of empires. One is obviously these third world or developing world countries where the Soviets had seen opportunities to develop strategic alliances. Some they did very overtly, like Afghanistan and invading it. Some they did more covertly. But I, you know, went out with these forces in Cambodia. I went out with the Sihanouk forces in the middle of the Cambodian jungles, and I went out with Jonas Savimbi in Angola, who ran the UNITA forces against the communist regime, the MPLA, that was backed by the Cubans and Soviets, pretty much installed by the Cubans and the Soviets, and with the Contras in our own hemisphere in Nicaragua. None of these movements were perfect by any means. I'm not trying to say, hey, these were Jeffersonian democratic movements, but they did seek freedom and they opposed communism and were sufficiently motivated to fight. My position was, if individuals around the world are willing to put their lives on the line, and they're going to do that to fight Soviet client states, we have an obligation to provide them with some support. And so that's what we did in the Reagan Doctrine. And that really was a defining transitional moment in the history of American foreign policy, because it signaled the end of the Truman Doctrine, which was one of containment, meaning we're going to be strong enough and deploy nuclear weapons, you know, into Europe, et cetera, to deter the Soviets. My position was, no, we're going to actually begin to roll this back. And so the obvious rollback was the Reagan Doctrine in the developing world. But then I described, you know, the Warsaw Pact itself was, you know, waiting to break away. And then the Soviet Union, some might say like China today, was comprised of internal colonies, meaning Ukraine didn't want to be communist, and they didn't even want to be affiliated with Russia, and the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and you go on and on. You just looked at the former Soviet Union, and I'd had the benefit of being there in the Cold War to visit. It didn't have the support that you could see being sustainable. And I said, one prominent victory in these conflicts, and it's going to send a signal and destroy this perception of invincibility that existed. And Afghanistan clearly was one of those, because as much as the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was such a graphic example of their expansionist inclinations, the video images of their tanks rolling out of Afghanistan a little over 9 years later was equally telling to the whole world, not just to Afghanistan. The whole world said, what do you mean? You mean the United States and a few other countries provided support to these Afghan forces in the mountains, and they drove out the superpower, the Soviet Union, the Red Army, and we did that. And I'm sure you're probably well aware of how there were a lot of subcomponents to it. I was one of the big champions of the Stinger missile technology, which was a sort of heat-seeking anti-aircraft shoulder-held missile, and it didn't require a lot of training. And we moved it into Afghanistan from Pakistan, on horseback half the time, and pretty quickly the Mujahideen, shot down over 400 Soviet aircraft with the Stingers. And of course, the Soviets sustained thousands of KIAs in it, and it became an incredibly unpopular war within the Soviet Union, much like Vietnam did in the United States. And Gorbachev ultimately labeled it a bleeding wound. He called it a bleeding wound. And where they were clearly not going to be obtaining a military victory, and that led them to conclude that the whole venture needed to had the plug pulled on it. It's really an enormously complex, multiple sort of chaptered story of Afghanistan's intermingling with global events since the 70s. And we're living through that right now, because for the life of me, I honestly, every step that Biden has taken on this was either consciously designed to hand this government to the Taliban. That's my thesis, by the way. If I'm wrong about that, and that's possible, be fair about it, it's possible. Then you're saying that, well, I'm not supportive of this administration, but you're talking about dozens of high-level government officials who have extraordinary experience on all of the operational components of this, and on Afghanistan itself, got like literally over a dozen major decisions consecutively wrong. And I find that very difficult to buy. I ultimately think there is a factor X that motivated Biden's decision-making that had nothing to do with Afghanistan. And the worst case scenario could potentially represent some conflict that he is confronting, and that was one of the reasons that of concern that I raised and others raised during the campaign. And here's some possible evidence. It obviously needs to be dived into, and very displeased with the entire management of it. Now, the big concern now is the future that I know want to address. And we have, in Xi Jinping and China's Communist Party, succeeded for a long time, and before, and all the way back to the 80s. Again, I was questioning, why are we contributing in our policy toward empowering China and seeing China? I can even recall confronting one of our ambassadors to China, Winston Ward, in a meeting, saying, look, we're ignoring all these human rights abuses. We consciously have these unfair trade policies, and his position, and it was reflective first with Kissinger and then with a whole body of students under him who ran this policy, was that China's growth, its economic growth, was a constructive development for the US, because it would put pressure on the CCP to liberalize. They wouldn't, with the blossoming middle class, they wouldn't be able to hold down the democratic aspirations of the people, or the aspirations for freedom. And the government itself would start to become more integrated into the West and through its trading relationships. And that has got to be the singular biggest miscalculation in modern American foreign policy, because the exact opposite has happened. And now, as you know, China has been labeled a genocidal regime for its treatment of the Uyghurs. And on the Afghanistan front, and broad number of, I mean, there's literally nothing that they're not engaged in, including the global pandemic and handling of that they are not, almost a criminal enterprise. They're called by some of the more hardline analysts in the United States a transnational criminal enterprise. And at first that sounded a little extreme. When you ponder the fact that they're engaged in organ harvesting, they're engaged for profit, killing people without even anesthesia, removing their organs. They're moving fentanyl into the United States, killing Americans just for profit. This is a regime that's operating like the Soviet Union did, without any sense of moral principle, and with a very aggressive plan, most critical to Afghanistan, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, that they see Afghanistan being a critical transport route, between Kabul and Pakistan, probably Peshawar, Pakistan.
That's true. In fact, that was the point I was coming to subsequently, with the American attention now in its geopolitical priorities shifting largely to the Indo-Pacific and South China Seas. Is Afghanistan going into the background and landing or giving Afghanistan and Pakistan in a platter to China and possibly Russia in the combination of BRI and Eurasian Corridor projects, which is a huge economic project which may change a lot of things internationally.
Yeah, because I'm really spent a lot of time studying and learning the Taliban as a sort of enemy force and its modus operandi, which is seemingly irrational a lot of times. But there's two characteristics that are predominant to the Taliban. One is their ruthlessness and their heartlessness. I mean, they are incredibly violent, and they utilize their own interpretation of Sharia law, not even Sharia law. They utilize these as covers to conduct the most ruthless suppression of individuals and summary killings and the like. That's well known. What's less well known, but it's certainly known by China, it's known by Pakistan, and I would say it's known even by the Biden administration, they have no real operational capabilities. So if you're going to run a local grocery store, you have to have a few skill sets, as it relates to inventory management and pricing and, keeping a store clean. When you run a country, in which they are trying to represent that that's what they're doing, I contend what they've done is seize some government buildings by military force, and they have no legitimacy, and I want to get to that. But if the position is they are a government and they really haven't been recognized broadly that way yet, they don't have the operational skill sets or capabilities to do the most rudimentary governmental functions. They have no experience building roads, building schools, conducting elaborate foreign affairs, even managing a large defense. Predominantly on the domestic policy side of government, of the provision of social services and healthcare, and the challenges that are at a real crisis level right now in Afghanistan, have been, but are even in worse case now. They have no ability to do this, nor do they have the financial resources really to do it. So they've seized a lot of money that apparently looks a lot greater than what was originally estimated, but we've also frozen assets. So they're going to need some degree of major country, presumably's involvement to be able to sustain itself. Now, I believe the position of the United States, this is really my main message to anyone engaged on Afghanistan, is the Constitution of Afghanistan was developed by over 500 men and women in Afghanistan. They deliberated over it. It was an incredible act of, it was an incredible accomplishment for a government that did not have a history of developing democratic institutions or civil society or even the rule of law. But it was like our constitutional convention. I mean, they brought people together and they compromised and they debated, and ultimately was signed by the president. And since 2004, and to this day, that is the constitution of the of Afghanistan. Now, when you ask, well, what happens when the president of Afghanistan becomes incapacitated or dies, or in this case, flees the country? Do we just hand the government over to whoever's got some guns and says they run it? No, that's not what the Constitution says. And the article provision in the Constitution, which I went back and reread because I can recall the debate over this, is incredibly, it's a very well-written Constitution. It's not one that would ever work in the United States because it's got, kind of its Islamic component to it. But it very clearly specifies that in the absence of the president, that the interim vice president is to assume the presidency on an interim basis. So that's Soleil, who is now with Masood's son.
Yes.
And I'm in touch with them. I'm sure you saw that Soleil's first tweet, actually, after the fall of Kabul, was his retweet of my position on the Constitution. I don't say that by way of bragging. I say that by way of pointing out how little thinking is going into Afghanistan, even by those on, the anti-Taliban side of things. So I am in touch with them, and I think they have an opportunity still at this moment, because the rule of law is the most logical course of action. And I would say that
do you think the international community will come in adequate support for Saleh and the erstwhile Northern Alliance?
Not naturally. They're not going to naturally gravitate that, because there's guys with guns on the street, and they've seized buildings, and they've put people in as ministers. Some of these, and one of whom, by the way, is literally on the FBI most wanted list. I mean, incredible that they invited the U.S. to be present at their. They just took September 11th, to do the as some random date to inaugurate their ministers, but literally one of those ministers on the FBI most wanted list. I feel this is a battle of ideas, and it could end up being a battle in a war sense. So I don't want war for Afghanistan. I want peace for Afghanistan. But let me just say, I think the position that has to be made broadly, and this is the position that Joe Biden, as the 46th president of the United States, should be making, and isn't, is that this Constitution is the path forward. And if you are a country of the world that's going to come in and stomp on the Constitution that the people of Afghanistan developed and have had in place for 16, 17, years, you're setting a precedent. It's not just about Afghanistan, but when East Turkestan or Tibet or Hong Kong declare their independence, and trust me, they're more than happy to do that right now. You're setting the precedent that your rule of law has no global ramifications, and is no binding influence beyond your perception of it, and that we should feel free to go in and begin recognizing these governments simply because they either militarily have seized some government buildings or have declared themselves a government. And that's my position on the Taliban. There is zero basis to be acknowledging them as a government. They have been elected by no one. They are documentably engaged in war crimes. And I've said they belong in The Hague facing the charges on that, not in Kabul, attempting unsuccessfully almost completely to run these ministries that they have no even experience in. They put people in charge of these ministries who have extraordinary challenges in this country and have no functional expertise in the areas they're governing, and no resources, even if they did have the expertise with which to do it. So the logical approach would be to take this component, this provision of the Afghan constitution, to say, to the credit of the people of Afghanistan, they did provide a course forward in a circumstance like this. And then for interim President Saleh, the challenge, he has a challenge too. And I think he's done a good job with this so far, but he's got to get his message out broader. And that is that he has to make it clear that he accepts this constitution. He's not depicting himself as the president. He's depicting himself as the interim president. And under the provisions of that constitution, would be required to hold new elections in that country quickly. And then obviously, if the Taliban want to participate in those elections, they should be invited to do so. But let me just tell you, as kind of a expert on the Taliban, they're not going to have any interest in doing that because the support that they have in that country doesn't much exceed 15%. And it's one of the reasons they've rejected participation historically and have resorted to, basically 50, 60,000 guys with machine guns who've taken over. This is just an incredible. If this had happened in the early 20th
but we can't forget that there's a very strong ISI and Pakistan support behind them with which they are able to do this. But anyway, let me. We are running, coming close to our time, and there are a few questions. Michael, here's a question from Admiral Sheikh Hasina. And so he thanks you for your insightful discourse on Afghanistan and Taliban. This gives us very credible information to what and how the Taliban happened this time around. My question is, how do you see the future of Taliban regime? For now, China is happy pushing its continental strategy using OVOR or BRI through the Central Asian republics. What happens if Taliban government fails? Do you see another geopolitical upheaval, or that may not happen? So this is, yes, that's the future.
Yeah, so the CCP has a very developed vision for this, and it's one, as I've thought about it since the fall of the government, it fits in. It's not just the Belt and Road Initiative, but let me just give you another area. I mentioned the fentanyl, which brings in billions of dollars of revenue to the CCP globally, the largest distributor globally of this highly deadly drug. What do we have in Afghanistan? 95% of the world's opium market. So I think they have 95% of the fentanyl market. I can't imagine that they're not looking at this as being another part of essentially this criminal undertaking that's the foundation of their economy. And then from a strategic standpoint, from Central Asia standpoint, you have the Belt and Road Initiative. By the way, it's often described as an economic development plan, and obviously there are components of development that are in it, but it's ultimately a military plan. It's a plan that will monopolize key transport routes in ways that are going to inevitably close out the United States and the West and provoke conflict. And it sort of has been the case with their actions in the South China Sea. So firstly, the CCP is much closer to the Taliban than is being reported. The Taliban made their famous visit a few months before taking power, as you might recall, to Beijing, met at a high level with the foreign ministry, but the relationship and the ties go back immensely strong. If you're an Afghan and you're looking at the Taliban saying you don't like the Taliban, but you think they somehow take Islam and the Muslim religion seriously, let me ask you, who in their right mind would formulate a relationship with a government that is engaged in genocidal treatment of millions of Muslims? Only a regime who is using their religious affiliation as cover for their real designs, which are financial enrichment and power. That's what the Taliban are after. So the CCP is an option, but let me just say also it'll be intriguing because a few other moving parts here are, is the Northern Alliance sort of able to initiate military pressure? Even to bring about negotiations would be a constructive development, because you have to execute the final part of the plan that I'm laying out here. You have to disarm the Taliban. So even right now, if we moved ahead and did this, how it would be very difficult to, in the absence of a UN presence or something like that, you would need to disarm the Taliban and not have them engaged in disrupting the elections that are provided for under this. There's a second component here is that, do the Taliban kind of look at this astutely and realize that the CCP is coming in to, basically extract all of their valuable mineral resources. I guess the most valuable, which is probably the gems, all of these key minerals that are used in high-end technology development that they have basically unmined at this point. And do they recognize that they're being used as part of a broad global expansion plan and are going to be seen by the CCP as being easily discarded at some point in the future once they don't need them? I don't know if they're sophisticated enough to see that or if they even care, but you could see I could see possible tension down the road as it relates to that. And there's already purportedly been some tension in the Pakistan relationship. Which is difficult to envision, given as you pointed out and I pointed out, the fact that the Taliban likely wouldn't exist without Pakistan's huge engagement and the safe harbor that they gave them throughout the war and the safe harbor they gave Al-Qaeda before that. Then there's the final missing component here is that let's assume that they do end up creating, worst case scenario, a terrorist super state, right? And you have all of these movements that they provide safe harbor to. Pressure is going to build on the United States to act quickly on that, because acting quickly is going to be itself costly, but acting on it 5 years from now is going to be World War material and enormously more complicated and more deadly and more difficult. So I hate to be someone who's disparaging of my president, but I have to say I believe this is a singular worst administration. And by the way, its popularity in the United States is deteriorating rapidly, and questions of even his legitimacy are increasing rapidly. And I don't see 4 years of smooth sailing for him. So the other moving part here is what happens with the United States government.
That makes it very complex. There are three questions, Michael, before we come to the close. One, let me Call out the question from Air Chief Marshal Gagan Bulat Sengala. He is the former Chief of Air Staff of the Sri Lankan Navy, Air Force. His question is, if the overseas funds are not released, what would be the way forward to the Taliban? And here's the second question. I'll also call that out.
So you mean the former government's resources that we've frozen?
Yeah, much of the financial resources, the US
and we should not release those funds.
We should not release. But what will happen to Taliban?
You release, I would say it's kind of the inverse of that question, is that if you release the funds, then you're affording the Taliban resources.
Absolutely.
That can be utilized militarily. And that's the problem with all of the, they're not the first tyrannical regime we've had to face down, is that these regimes always place military conquest above the human and needs of their people. And it's also usually one of the biggest mistakes that these governments make, because it increases dramatically the opposition that they ultimately face. And, I'll just say those left behind in Afghanistan, I gave you the 15% number, that leaves you 85% of that country not supportive of this government. Now, there aren't many examples around the world of governments that sustain themselves too long with support levels that low. And when you're persecuting women, suspending their educational and employment possibilities that they've come to get used to over the last 20 years, and arbitrarily killing people on the streets because of some rumor, like they're doing, and going home to home with lists of people they're looking for, the opposition is going to build. I mean, yes, you might be able to take out some of your opponents, but you're also going to take out the whatever lingering little bit of neutrality or popularity that you have. And so I haven't given up on Afghanistan, and no one should. And when the question is, well, what should we do? I think I'm pretty alone in putting forward. A few other people have bought into it now as well. This approach of saying, go back to the rule of law, which actually, to the credit of the Afghan people, provides the road forward in this unusual set of circumstances.
That's right. Here's a question from Air Marshal Harish Masan. Wouldn't it be wise under the current circumstances for the international community to starve Afghanistan and their biggest supporter Pakistan economically? If China wishes to foot the bill, I wonder if they will also find the quagmire too demanding for them, particularly now when a financial bubble is almost ready to burst. Wouldn't such a strategy be pull the rug from under the Taliban's and ISI's feet?
Well, I'm one person, but I do want to tell you, at as high level as I have I'm in touch with governments of the world, in Pakistan and in the government of China, which has been carefully glued into a lot of things that I've been saying lately. I've said, do not recognize the Taliban as a government because there will be consequences.
That's right.
And I'm in touch with the opposition forces in Afghanistan, and so it's not an idle threat. But that's a message that really should be coming from our government and from our president. And it's not just atrocious, all of these irrational decisions that were seemingly made, but even in the public addresses that he's had and the press conferences he's had, you can just see he has no logical explanation for them. I mean, it's not like, you and I know that these are complicated issues, and to get it right 100% of the time is difficult. So it's not like he's getting up and saying, look, we really botched this. Here's what made it difficult. Here's why it was botched. And the reason I believe that you're not hearing that, which would be the best approach to take on, and honesty is the best approach when you have errors in policy judgment. The reason you're not hearing that from him is that's not what happened. All of these decisions that on the surface look totally irrational were highly strategically designed exactly with this in mind. And my thesis is that the CCP has leverage over Biden, maybe threatening Biden, but he clearly handed Afghanistan to the Taliban and in turn possibly to the CCP as a product of that. And this air base that I think is underestimated in strategic value.
Absolutely. Here's the last question. Of course, one more will be there. How much is this is the question from one of our young research scholars, Shraddha, and the question is, how much were the American training for Afghans to fight war in the American way contributed to their meltdown as Taliban, rapidly moved to Kabul?
I'm glad that was asked because there's a few points there. Number one is that I think you can argue safely that the Afghan army, which was at least twice the size of the Taliban, was very successful when they were fighting side by side with U.S. intelligence and air cover, and with the United States there. In the absence of the U.S., when they're having to sort of go about all of these things, not just alone, but alone for the first time, I think that was advantage Taliban. And anyone familiar with this war would have been acutely aware of the fact that you were putting this Afghan military in a position of disadvantage. There's another issue that I think also is potentially reflective of Biden's undermining the Afghan government and empowering the Taliban, and that is the payment of the Afghan military and army was changed and moved from indirect payments to payments through the actual government, which in turn was not disseminating the payments to the military all the way back to, this was a decision in April. So among, individuals I know, not naming names, but people who are still there, that are looking to get out and haven't been taken out, they hadn't been paid since April. Now, I'm not saying that that's a singular factor, but in a long list of issues, the fact that you're being asked to fight for a government that hadn't paid you in 4 months and put your life on the line is probably not a motivating factor as it relates to their willingness to do that. And so that, to me, also is receiving an insufficient amount of scrutiny and attention.
Thank you, Michael. It's been wonderful. But one last question, and I can't stop myself asking you that. I want your views. Where does that leave India? Contributed so much, worked so much in Afghanistan, building goodwill, infrastructure, invested over $3 billion. Now in this, with the US completely having walked out of Afghanistan, the Taliban taking over, Pakistan in full control, where does that leave India and in the future?
For India? Yeah. I have said that the United States-India bilateral relationship has never been more important than in any moment before, really since India's independence from colonialism until now. And I say that as someone who during the Cold War felt India's position of neutrality was an enormous disservice to the forces of freedom in the Cold War. And I pointed that out, but I've come to have a great degree of respect for Modi as a head of state and a leader. I think he's managed Afghanistan much more successfully than obviously this administration, the Biden administration, has done. I'm astonished also, I didn't even mention this, that when Biden was asked, what foreign heads of state he had consulted with on the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, he hadn't called Xi Jinping, hadn't called Putin, hadn't called Modi, hadn't called the Pakistanis, hadn't called the Saudis, which have been historically pretty involved, hadn't called the president who fled, hadn't called the interim president, hadn't called the Taliban, and didn't call Boris Johnson in the UK, whose forces lost, I think they lost a few hundred in Afghanistan. He had zero communication with heads of state following the collapse of Kabul to the Taliban. That to me, again, why are you not having these conversations? Because you have no story to tell them. It's completely indefensible.
Absolutely.
So India is vital, and we need to, and of course the CCP, again, not something getting a lot of attention in the West, has been threatening, as you know, some of the territorial borders of India, and has been engaged in a broad range of hostile acts toward India. And the only thing I want to see from India is, I know it has this somewhat admirable history of embrace for neutrality on issues, but sometimes an embrace of neutrality can leave you with no need for neutrality because one side wins and one side loses. And let me say, I think we're engaged right now in a geopolitical struggle with the CCP, where this isn't going to end in a tie. We're either going to ultimately prevail in this, as we did in the Cold War, or we're going to lose. And India has a great stake, and it shares the values that we share, and it's the world's largest democracy. We cannot see, we've got to be hand in glove with India, supporting India, helping India, providing, whatever military support and technologies they need, and working with them in a very collaborative way to confront what are now a broad array of strategic challenges to our mutual interests. And I believe we have the same interests in the region.
I get the point. India has to take a very strong stand and be firm on which side we actually work on. I agree with you. Thank you, Michael. It's been a wonderful session.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to keeping in contact with you, and I hope you'll keep up the messaging and pressure as well.
We'll do that on behalf of the Peninsula Foundation. I thank you for this wonderful session and excellent views. We've enjoyed the evening greatly, and good morning to you again. Thank you very much. All the best.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you.